while she's doing that, I will welcome everybody here and thank you for joining us today. And for those of you just joined us, this is being recorded. So if you don't want your picture shown on the web for our YouTube channel, you can turn your cameras off. This is a part of our third Sunday of the month speaker series that we have at the FANHS Museum. When we were having, before COVID, we had in-person presentations, but of course now we're going through Zoom, and we put it up on our YouTube channel so other people can see it and learn and hear about the history of Filipino Americans. And today we welcome Marie Vallejo, who will be talking about the colonizations of the Philippines. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Richard Tunaza, our president of our FANHS Museum Board, and he will do introductions.
Thank you, Terry. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Marie Vallejo. Marie was born in the Philippines, but she was a U.S. citizen because her dad, Saturnino Silva, was in the Philippine infantry here in the U.S., but he immigrated to the U.S. in 1929. And Marie came to the U.S. for the first time when she was 9 years old. After being born in the Philippines, she came to the U.S. when she was 9. And after that, she just kind of moved back and forth between the Philippines and here. She went to school in San Francisco, Star of the Sea Elementary School, Mercy High School, San Francisco State. Then after San Francisco State, she went back to the Philippines and graduated from Maryknoll College. Marie worked for Intel Corporation in Santa Clara until she retired, and then she began pursuing her interest, or maybe that's not when she began, but she had more time to pursue her interest in Filipino participation in World War II. And this took Marie to the National Archives, where she and a team of helpers scanned 300,000 documents, I can't imagine, related to Filipino participation in World War II. I found 836 of those online. I don't know how many are really online, but 836 is the number that I found. Doing her work in the archives, Marie was supported by the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office in the Philippines, which is very interesting to me that the Philippine Veteran Affairs Office was supporting her work here. But of course it's related, because we're dealing with Filipino veterans. And with that, I want to turn it over to Marie, who can finish the introduction, since she knows herself better than I do, and then go on with the presentation. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Marie. So thank you for being here. And the screen is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Pretty long one. Shall I start now? Yes. Okay. Well, first, let's see. First of all right. Let me take a look here. First of all. Okay. Here we go. See. Okay. First of all, I wanted to thank you for attending this talk that I'm going to be given. I'm glad that you're interested in your Filipino heritage and history. Because when I lived in California, I attended several FANHS conferences and heard many Filipino Americans ask the same question, who am I? And that baffled me to some extent and thought of maybe there's some kind of a missing link here. So when I retired in the Philippines, I saw that there is this sort of disconnect. And I hope to help answer the many questions that you might have, by explaining the life in the Philippines, that many forefathers of Filipino Americans to find out where they came from. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Okay. What I'm going to be talking about are highlights, pretty much highlights, because each topic of a highlight can cover many books and articles. And really, if you really want to delve into it. So just for the purpose of this, so that we can answer the questions, I'm just going to cover these highlights as a background. Here are the topics I'm going to try and cover. Okay, I'll be using the highlights. It's going to be of events in the Philippines that brought Filipinos to the US. They had many reasons for departing the Philippines from different classes of people. Their presence in the US, that's what began the generations of Filipino Americans. I'm going to go into the quick background so you understand why we have all of these influences in our lives. Before the American period began, the Philippine Wars, the Philippine was under the Spanish rule. Filipinos continuously fought Spanish rule, and several leaders stood out at that time. In the Filipinos' fight from the colonial rule of Spain and America, these are some of the generals that led armies of resistance. In the Philippine Revolution, war against Spain, there was a General Emilio Aguinaldo who fought for a free and independent Philippines. He declared himself president of the first republic of the country in 1898. It was short-lived because the country was soon turned over to the United States. He continued to resist, though, under the American rule, and more Filipino blood was shed until his capture in 1901. After Aguinaldo's capture comes General Miguel Malvar. He assumed the command of the revolutionary forces. He fought against the Spaniards and also of the US. The third general was Macario Sakay. He also fought in the Philippine Revolution against Spain and in the Philippine-American War. After the war was declared over by the Americans in 1902, he continued to resist. He led many guerrilla raids until his capture, and he was hanged. I want to touch on this special group because in the 14th century, Islam spread to Borneo. As you can see, Borneo is right here. A lot of the people would just cross, and it would only take a couple of hours from Borneo to this archipelago, the Sulu archipelago. So when the 14th century Islam spread to Borneo, it went then to the Sulu archipelago and then to Mindanao, right here. This is Palawan, sorry. This is Palawan, this is the Sulu archipelago right here. And this area was Borneo. And then it spread on to Mindanao. When the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, the various Muslim groups united to resist throughout the next 300 years of Spanish rule. When the Americans defeated the last of the leaders of the Philippine-American War on Luzon, which is up here, all those three generals earlier, they turned to the south, Mindanao, to take control. The Muslims did not like that. They were called Moros by the Filipino Christians. The Moros did not want to wage war or be subject to another ruler. This is the beginning of the American period. That began with the end of the Spanish-American War. The US did not initially want the Philippines because they only wanted Puerto Rico and Guam, which was closer to them. The Philippines was too far away to govern, but they figured, all right, let's, I guess, give it a try across the Pacific Ocean. The Filipinos, though, were not happy with another colonial ruler. Their life under Spain was constricting already and many times brutal, all in the name of Christianity. When the Americans took over, they resisted for 4 years, with hundreds and thousands dying to remove another ruler. The US called it an insurrection, but the Filipinos considered it a war. The population suffered throughout the brutal pacification campaign of America. As the resistance to the American rule was eradicated, the American regime began a public school system of education and then also sanitation. The first teachers were volunteer American soldiers. Soon, over 500 Americans arrived to teach all over the islands. They came on board the ship Thomas, so were named Thomasites. As you could see, there is this Gabaldon schoolhouses on the left. During the American period, over, let's see, 1,800 of them were erected. English was taught from the first grade. Concerned with the health of the population, a sanitation program was established by the Americans that mandated setups of latrines and covered sewage canals. Sanitary inspectors conducted inspections and regular medical vaccinations were enforced. See, before, when the Filipinos were living in nipa huts or in elevated huts with bamboo slats on the floor, with bamboo and slats between the bamboo on the floor, human waste would just be dropped through the slats of the bamboo floors to the pigs and the livestock below. And that was not very sanitary. Under the American regime, qualified students called pensionados were given funds to attend school. Some stayed with American families. The goal was to prepare these pensionados for when the Philippines has its own self-governance, and they would be able to return to become members of the Philippine government. In the second year of the program, the first Filipino pensionados were chosen, numbering 5 out of 39 female pensionados. This was a rarity because women were supposed to stay at home with chaperones and become learned in a domestic field so as to marry well and just be continued to be taken care of. 1906, the first Filipinos who left, so aside from the ones in the Louisiana area. During the American regime, over 100,000 Filipino men were brought or went to Hawaii to work in the sugar and pineapple plantations from 1906 until 1946. The earliest sacadas were men from the Visayan Islands in the central part of the Philippines, not from the north, but in the central part. 1920s and 1930s. Although the period of the 1920s and 30s were peaceful and progressive in the Philippines, there were those who wanted a better life, earn more for their families. Many had limited education. The Manongs arrived in the 20s and 30s when California laws enforced rampant discrimination in work and salary. They had no choice but to work in the low-playing fields of the Central Valley. But when they wrote home, they sent postcard photos of themselves dressed well. Here's a Filipino photographer would have suits, shoes, and hats to lend to these men for their photos. While the men were departing for the US, the lifestyle in Manila was the best time, according to the residents of the city. They called it peacetime. Most men wore white shirts and pants and a hat whenever they went out. Older women continued to wear their native dresses with the butterfly sleeves. But the younger ones now wore Western clothing and ate American canned foods and eagerly listened to American swing band music. Around Manila and the major cities, the Americans erected buildings on a large scale of concrete, steel, and glass. The buildings were of neoclassical architecture and Art Deco by famous American and Filipino architects. (1934). The Philippine lawmakers, they continued to clamor for independence from the US during peacetime. So in the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which was the Philippine Independence Act, was established the process for the Philippines to become an independent country after a 10-year period. The Philippine Commonwealth government was established, and but the unlimited entry of Filipinos to the US were limited to only 50 per year. From 1942 to 1945, the process was suspended when the Japanese invaded the islands. During that time, with the Tidings-McDuffie Act, a constitution was drafted by the US, but they continued to be in charge of the foreign affairs and military forces. This photo shows one of the delegates, Manuel Rojas, signing the Philippine Constitution. He later became president of the Philippines after the war. In the 20s and 30s, you would think that life wasn't so bad in the Philippines. So why did some Filipinos leave for the US? These were poor farmers and men who left wanting a better life. Many had no intention of staying permanently in the US. They wanted to save up enough to return and bring back some savings. But they did not expect the discrimination that did not allow them to get a well-paying job. So it was a vicious circle. To survive, they had to resort to menial work or farm labor work. They were transient, moving with the seasonal work. They could not save up enough to go back. Another group, the Pensionados, they were sent to further their education and return to the Philippines to run the family business or take positions in the Philippine government. Some were sent to West Point to return and become an officer in the Philippine Army and Philippine Scouts. The Pensionados did not stay in the Philippines. They returned to the Philippines, majority of them. Then there was another group. These were the self-supporting students. They saw the Pensionados as having been able to complete their education. They too wanted an American education. They had some higher educations in the Philippines and could speak English. They did not realize that the Pensionados were supported by the Philippine government, and many stayed with American families. With the rampant discrimination, they could not find a decent job also to be able to go to school and support themselves. So they wound up working in the low-paying jobs in the farms. But they were the determined ones. They worked in the agricultural fields and in the Alaskan canneries in the summer. But during the school year, they worked as houseboys and attended classes. The photo on the right shows the Oriental Club in 1934 at San Francisco State Teachers College. If you're able to lean closely, you can see that the president at that time, that in the fall, was Saturnino Silva. That was my father. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929, many who came to study in the US were unable to continue their studies and became laborers full-time. Many did not return to the Philippines. Before I end my talk, I'd like to add what happened to the Filipino men in the US when the war broke out. Thousands volunteered to fight for America and drive the invaders from their motherland. The First Filipino Battalion was created to allow them to bear arms because they were not American citizens. A year later, the regiment of men were naturalized as citizens. The men who joined during the war were mostly the Manongs, who picked and harvested the fields of California. There were some who were professionals like doctors and lawyers from the East Coast. They wanted to prove to the US that they were as good as any white American. Discrimination was not as rampant and prolonged in the military. Some joined the service to meet a Filipina and bring back to the US. That's the reason why some of us saw Filipino men 15 years or more older than their wives. They were the Manongs. You may have a grandfather or father who was a veteran, married a Filipina, and returned to the US or stayed in the Philippines after the war. Then 20 years later, the Immigration and Nationality Act allowed more Filipinos to enter the US. Thank you. And I hope to answer any questions that you may have.
Anybody have any questions for Marie?
see. Yeah, Marie,
Mm-hmm.
you said that the original cicadas they were recruited from the Philippines were not from the Ilocos provinces, but from the Visayan provinces. Is that right?
You know, oh, okay. Let's see. Who was that? Was that Richard?
Yes.
Richard, could you it's kind of garbled. Could you type the question in the chat box, please? So I could answer it properly.
Okay.
He was talking about the original cicadas.
Okay.
And
You're
had
clearer,
mentioned-
Terry. Yeah.
Yeah. Richard, just maybe you need to get a little bit closer to your, or turn up your mic.
I can do
But
that.
anyway, you had mentioned they were originally from the Visayan area.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
Richard,
Yeah. That's contrary to what I'd read previously. The original recruitment was done from the Ilocos provinces, I thought, in 1906, and then some from Panay and some of the central Visayans, but the majority, at least in the beginning, I thought were from Ilocos. Could you give me a reference on that?
he was wondering if you had any references to it because he originally had read some documentation that they were from the
Majority.
The Ilocos area, which is in Luzon.
yeah.
Yes. Most of them were actually from the Visayas. Most of research sources have said. Now, it was from that period, very early, just the turn of the century, to 1946. So in the latter part, the Ilocos, probably those from the Ilocos, then also traveled as sacadas. But the original ones were actually recruited, then others, to follow without being recruited as sacadas. So does that answer your question, Richard?
I'd like to have a reference on it. If you could send me a reference.
References? Well, I'll have to look up in my files on where the references would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other, okay, there's another person who wrote about the sacadas because her father was a sacada. It's Pat. She lives in Hawaii. I'm sure if you look up her book on sacadas, Pat Brown, I think Pat Brown is her name. Yeah, I've met her. Her dad was a sacada, and that's why she retired from mainland US to Hawaii. And she wrote the book. And she would probably be able to answer even more details on the sacadas. But from my research, it was initially from the Visayas.
Thank you.
Okay.
Someone is asking if you have any information about the Filipinos movements from the West Coast to the Midwest.
From the West Coast of the US?
Yeah, for like, say, why did they go from, if they came in and they went to California or the West Coast, then what was their succession of going over to the Midwest?
When the Filipinos came, I think, okay, a lot of them on the East Coast were mostly professionals. They had professional jobs. They were doctors, lawyers. In research, that always shows that. Because those like laborers working in the fields, it wasn't there. It wasn't present on the East Coast. So those who went there, even until now, a lot of the doctors are in the East Coast and lawyers and things of that sort. So I think they went there for education and that opportunity. And then they stayed behind there. When the war broke out, a lot of them joined the war and they got sent over to California for training.
Okay.
But do you have anything at all about them coming to Chicago? Because my dad came to the States in 1929, and he was part of that Manong group. And then he came to Chicago, but I don't know if that was just a few families that were moving to Chicago area, or was there a whole slew of people coming? And I just wondered if you had any information regarding how the Filipinos landed in Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan.
Okay, always was shown is that when the Filipinos departed from the Philippines, you know, they would board on these ships. It would be like my Empress of China, Empress of Asia. That was the ship that my dad was on, and then there was the Empress of several of these ships, and they landed usually in Vancouver in Canada. So that was the first landing, and then they would have, many of them would have families who would meet with them or meet them, and then from there, I guess, would move on across the United States to Chicago, depending on what the reasons were. If they wanted to advance their education, or they're, you know, as a doctor or professional, or they had families already in the East Coast. But all of the landing of the ships from the Philippines had to first be on the West Coast. So my dad arrived in Vancouver, and from there down to California.
Thank you.
A suggestion.
Hello, Mary.
Can I suggest something? Wait, one more. I just thought there are books now that are coming out with like Filipinos in Washington, D.C., Filipinos in San Francisco. If you can find that series of books that would say Filipinos in Chicago, you might find something there. It might not be just your dad's real name, but at least it would say when Filipino groups were arriving in Chicago. That's still part of past history of the Filipinos into Chicago.
I'm in Wisconsin right now, and we're trying to, you know, gather the history of the Filipinos who landed in Wisconsin somehow or another. Unfortunately, many have passed away already. So it's always interesting to hear some connections to some of the things that you mentioned in your talk today. I had heard about from my godparents or my father, you know, especially during World War II and being part of the Philippine Infantry and Camp Cook and getting their citizenship through their service before they were, you know, even citizens. They were, you know, serving in World War II. So that part is interesting, and to see all the little pieces of the puzzle, I say, that you're putting together to try to get a little bit more history. And so thank you for adding more pieces to the puzzle.
Oh, you're welcome.
Ed, did you have
Hey,
something?
Mary. Yes. Hey, Mary. My dad came from the Philippines in 1927, landed in Seattle, and eventually worked his way to Chicago. And his what you may call barcadas in Chicago were mostly work in restaurants, because they don't have much farm field in the Chicago area, so they work in restaurants. And my dad worked in the as a shipping clerk in a music company. And there were basically no Filipinas in Chicago at that time, the 20s and the 30s. So the Filipinos dated Caucasian women, mostly from Eastern Europe, who worked in the same restaurant as the Filipinos did. So that's why a lot of Filipinos in Chicago then married Irish women or Eastern European women and stuff like that. So there's a Filipino community at that time in Chicago. And you mentioned a book, Filipinos in Chicago. That's it deals a lot on Filipinos in Chicago in the 20s and 30s and up to the 60s. And they even have a Rizal Day, or every December 30th, they have a party in some hotels. They're all wearing their best suits and stuff like that.
And that was a very large gathering, because I have a picture of my parents at one of those Rizal days, and it was a packed room. They must have had several hundred people. It looks like maybe 300-400 in the picture. And it was a really big affair. My dad worked for Rappaport Luggage Company, and when he was in the Chicago area. So that was another one. And then a lot of them married Mexican Americans. That's my particular heritage. And there was a apartment building, I think it was on LaSalle and, oh, what is it? Something with a D. I can't think of it now. Diversity, Divinity, something like that. Some street in Chicago. I'm not as familiar with the Chicago area. But anyway, there was a whole group of Filipinos. And of course, there was discrimination, and they didn't want to rent to the Filipinos. And so my mother actually got the apartment for them. And then the manager was saying, oh, we don't have Filipinos here. And she said, well, what about all those apartments up there? They're all Filipinos in those apartments there. And because they had been rented to the wives who were either Mexican American or Irish American or Italian American, whatever. And but the husbands were all Filipinos. And so they lived in that area of town for many, many years.
Thank you, Isabel.
This
Letty?
is, yeah, Beatrice Perez. First, I want to say something very personal. Edward Bonilla, you're related to me. Morelia family. And I would like your address because your father or grandfather came and met my mother in 1947 after the war ended. And I thought I met you at one of the conference, but I lost track of you because you wanted a picture of your dad, and I have that.
Oh, yes, if you could send it to me. It's a picture of my dad in uniform.
Yes.
With Letty's mom, I believe.
With my mother.
Yeah, if you could send it to me, I'll.
Well,
I think you're my friend, my Facebook friend. So I'll send you my.
Well, you'll have to send me your email address or something.
Yeah, I will. I'll do that.
Okay. Then the other thing is Jeannie Baroga. Are you there?
Say again.
Jeannie Baroga. Was she on the line here on Zoom? Jeannie Baroga was from Wisconsin. So her father, who's related to my husband,
Okay.
I met Jeannie after she had come to the West Coast. So anyway, I thought if Jeannie was here, she could say something about her dad. But he was a band and radio personality, music.
Hi, I'm here. Sorry, I don't have my picture up, I guess. But thank you, Aunt Letty. I think I was a neighbor in another life with Isabel if she was in the Midwest. So we were Milwaukee.
That's it. Do you know how your dad got to Wisconsin or Milwaukee? Why he got there?
Mine? He was traveling as a musician from California to Chicago, back and forth, and then decided that because of my mother, she said she wanted him to settle down, so they settled in nearby Milwaukee from Chicago. He could still get to Route 66 at that point and move around, but he based himself in Milwaukee.
Where did he meet your mother?
They met after the war when his Filipino unit was stationed in Ormoc City. And he was actually just over a divorce, so he already had a reputation, and they fell for each other. And she had to go through the process of convincing her family that they were really in love. And so they got married. There's a lot of chasing, that's a whole nother story, but he brought her by steerage with the military to Seattle, and then down to San Francisco, then to Oakland, Berkeley area, and ended up in LA for a while before moving to the Midwest.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Is there, what other kind of research are you doing? Maria?
You asking, Terry, you asking me?
Yeah, what
Oh,
other kind
okay.
of research are you working on?
Let's see. Well, I wanted to share the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, Philippine Veterans Affairs Office of the Philippines. Okay, I led a project wherein we had we were 4 women, and we scanned the guerrilla records at the U.S. National Archives because they were crumbling. They were literally crumbling in our hands. So when we did, I just wanted to share that with everyone because it's now online, all of those records. And so if you have any relatives who fought in the war in the Philippines, in Bataan, Corregidor, and so on, that's another area where you can go in and research, about what they did and what happened to them. Right now, because of that, a lot of professors and historians in the Philippines are using those records as primary records to be able to teach, and write books or articles on them. At the same time, too, that's been used as proof for guerrilla units that, even though they were not recognized as a unit by the Americans in 1945-46, it still showed that they were a unit, and markers have been set up in some of the cities and towns because they're so proud that they have these heroes during the war. You see, during the war, most of the books are written by the Americans, and that's understandable because they are more articulate, they had more access to publishing and printing, and it was their story. But in their books, they would mention names of the Filipinos who fought with them. So in the case in the Philippines, not very many books were written because the guerrillas, of course, were not as educated. There were some who were educated and wrote some books, but they're like a handful of these books of their own stories, of their guerrilla units, and how they fought with the Americans. So that's the big connection right there, because now you always think a lot of people think that it's just the Americans who died in the Death March and in Corregidor, and most of them were the ones who fought in Bataan. Actually, it was 3-1 Filipinos died more and fought. Although that's another whole story and another talk I can continue on. So
where are the records? Where can they be found online?
Search on Philippine Collection, just that word, and then you will see. Okay, I'm going to type the message here to everyone. Okay, everyone in the meeting, it would be just search for
Philippine
just
Collection.
search Philippine Collection, right? And then you'll have many links in there.
Okay.
And these records, there's like 270 folders. See? These were cataloged by the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army Catalog, they did it in a way wherein, as the request for recognition for a military unit came in, they would just place it in the folders with the label of that unit name or with the commanding officer. What's inside could be the guerrilla unit and their stories on how they fought, because they're trying to tell their stories so that they can get the benefits. There was death benefits and education benefits, and so on. So with that, these are images. So there's no search engine for the inside of what's inside. So when you do a search, it would be best if you knew the unit and a commanding officer or the location of that guerrilla unit, and you might get a hit. A folder would come up. If not, then you have to continue searching to get as close as you can to a folder and just open it up and start reading. Yeah. It's quite a research, but now we have it, because when we went to the archives and we started scanning it, the records were literally crumbling in our hands. And our hands were black at the end of each day. There were dead insects, even dirt in those records. The National Archives in College Park, Maryland, when we asked them, do you have any plans to scan these, to preserve it? And they said they had no plans for it, because right now they're busy scanning their own presidential records, the Civil War, and things of that sort. So that's understandable. Some of those folders never been opened, I think, since 1945. So
Wow.
yeah, it's quite an interesting trove there. It's the Philippine Collection, and we only scanned 200. There's about 1,600 boxes. 1,600 boxes.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you got to some of them.
Well, yeah, because of when I was researching, I've been there several times to become a researcher, I came across it. And I said, why don't we know about this? Why? That's why Filipinos, all they know about is what happened in World War II. MacArthur came back. The Americans came back. That's not entirely true. That's not entirely true. There were other things that were happening. It wasn't just MacArthur and his forces. Yes, they were grateful for the Americans to coming back, but that's not the whole story. So that Philippine Collection is very important as part of Philippine American history during the war. The thing about that is, after the war, I read it, it said the US government offered it to the Philippine government, all of that information, because the Army keeps everything. They keep everything, copies of records and so on. So that's on each of those folders of each of those units, asking for recognition. So after the war, when that guerrilla recognition program was finished and closed, it took about 3 years, but they kept asking for extensions. They offered it to the Philippine government so that the Philippine government can keep it in their archives and so on, and then becomes part of research and articles. The Philippine government refused it. I know it sounds like a bad thing, but you know what? When I think of it now, with the capability of the National Archives of the Philippines, it's best that it's in the National Archives of the United States, because with the humidity and all of the humidity and everything that's happened after the war, they wouldn't have been able to keep it properly. So I also read this, that they said the orders was offered to the Philippine government. If they don't want it, burn it. I'm so glad they did not burn it.
Yeah.
I'm so glad.
Wow.
So if you want to research some more, College Park, Maryland, National Archives, Philippine Collection. I think a lot of people now are going in there, and I get a lot of questions here and there about that collection, about just the gorilla that we had put on the website of PVAO, Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. We put there.
Okay.
So, that's the story. Yes, I think opened up an awareness of that Philippine collection, which has been buried in the National Archives
Wow.
of the US.
Wow, I'm glad you guys did that. Boy.
I'm glad too. I'm glad too also.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Marie, or any more about her research?
Or questions of life in the Philippines before the war? That's
So,
Yes.
well, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay. Before the war, or after the Filipino-American War, the U.S. really brainwashed the entire population of the Philippines with textbooks and teaching and making it illegal to talk about the Filipino-American War. And so a lot of people grew up with kind of false impressions, I think, about what went on when the Americans defeated the Filipinos. I think maybe that's being cleared up now slowly, but but there was a lot of deception going on our part, deceiving the people of the Philippines. Can you comment on that?
Terry, could you help me out there? I'm getting static.
Well, he basically, he said after the Filipino-American War, that the
Yeah.
Filipinos basically were brainwashed with US, values,
Yeah.
because of textbooks and all that other stuff. And
Right.
the Filipinos couldn't talk about, or that it was illegal to talk about the war. So basically, what do you think about that?
I don't like to use brainwash.
Call it what you want.
I really don't, because they didn't they forced the education, okay, English from first grade, but they had so much more freedom and were treated more equal than during the Spanish time and the Japanese time. So of course, if you're treated properly, you'd gravitate towards that. I don't know. That's my opinion.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Textbooks with lies in them, I would consider to be brainwashing. I said when they school textbooks with lies about what happened, about the history, I would consider to be brainwashing.
Okay, if it's a textbooks, yeah. If it's a textbook, and if they did not mention, if they mention mostly American values and events and stuff like that, and then not Philippine events or values and stuff like that, then in a way that is an influencing, I still influencing and so on. And yeah, you could say some sort of brainwashing, but brainwashing, I think, is a very hard, it's a very hard word. It's almost like you actually fully control a person. I think that's all I could say.
Well, everybody's going to have their opinions on how
Yeah.
different, how history has affected everybody. That's all this stuff going on now,
Yeah.
with statues being taken down and all that, because, history is history, and different
Yeah,
people react to it differently.
Yes.
So-
Yeah. History is history, and the people who are interested in history or historians who write books on it, the best thing is that to just in their research write about and make people aware of what they found, and not necessarily so that it could be two contrasting ideas or opinions. And in that way, you make the reader decide for themselves. I have something here from Sharon Hoffman. She said that so many records were lost in the fire in St. Louis. I have two contrasting answers to this. When I was in Washington, D.C., I was with a group who met with the representative of Secretary of Defense, that cabinet of some sort. And we were talking about the recognition before the Congressional Medal of Honor, the recognition of the veterans because of the Rescission Act. And that a lot of the veterans received the answer that, oh, we can't find your records because there was a fire in St. Louis. Yes, there was a fire, but they said that the records of the veterans were not touched. That's why when I heard that, and I was in this conference room, I went, really? Okay, but that's what they said. Now, if a veteran had sent in and requested information, whoever received that request maybe did not find it and used the fire as a reason. I don't know. I'm speculating here. Another one is from Sharon. Is it illegal to discuss the Spanish-American War here in the textbooks? Yes, I would think that there would be some, how would you call it, softening of the Spanish-American War. But at the point of the way the treatment of the Filipinos was going on, I think it was kind of easy to influence them in that sense, and to accept contrasting regimental ideas. From Andres Tangalin, a forcible indoctrination to induce someone to give up basic political, social, or religious beliefs and attitudes, and to accept contrasting regimented ideas, Merriam-Webster. How much of that was happening during the American period? I cannot answer that completely and accurately, but I do believe that there was some indoctrination, just like what the Japanese did, just like what the Spanish did. But I can say that the Filipinos enjoyed more freedom and independence, and treated more equal than under their other colonial rulers. So if the textbooks say that, which right now, I think right now they're trying to pass a bill in the Philippine Congress to be able to teach Philippine history also in high school, because they eliminated it in high school, and it's only been taught in the 6th or 7th grade. So again, what's being taught in there, things of that sort.
Question.
Sharon Hoffman also says, I requested my uncle's records. I did not receive it, but a few burnt papers. What does that mean? Did you receive something or not? Sharon? Okay, she's gone.
Yes, I did receive his discharge paper and one other paper, but that was it. They were charred on the edges.
Well, that's usually what they send out, is the discharge papers. Discharge papers, and then there's also a piece of paper that shows I don't know what the title it is. It shows their name, their rank, and then where they have been during these years during the war, and then and then the medals or the awards that they received. I don't know if that's part of discharge papers, but that's another piece of paper.
When I requested my other uncles for the medal program, I received his entire file and with everything from his application, enlistment, and to discharge. So they wrote me a letter stating that my other uncle's papers had been destroyed in St. Louis. So there wasn't much, for his record. My uncle that was in the Navy, every battle that he fought in Guadalcanal, and he was on the USS San Francisco. So I was able to retain that and submit it to Fort Mason, I believe that is, in San Francisco, but not my uncle who fought in the Philippines, which was very, it was very discouraging to me not to have that, because it was so important to our history.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Marie.
Mm-hmm. So some were burnt and some were saved, or it's not included in the fire. I'm glad that you got that.
Chris, you had a question?
Yeah, yes, I did, Marie. The attitude of the population in the Philippines during repatriation, how were these people welcome? Were they welcome back home? They were, they bought the one-way ticket back, due to the Philippine Independence Act. And, were they welcome with open arms, or were they looked down upon for leaving, or, what was the feeling? Because the way you had it up there, the 1930s, you know, were, I guess, the golden age of colonialism.
Mhm. It was. They called it peacetime. The elders,
Right.
those were still alive. To them, that was the best of times.
Because I was just wondering if that group that bought the, you know, that bought the passage back home with their families that they had already had here in America, you know, did they tell their stories of what life was really like in, you know, in the United States at that time, how they were received and treated, and why'd they go back home?
Well, depending on what period they went back home. Was it
Well,
after the
1934.
war? Oh,
No,
1934.
1934, the repatriation.
Yes. Yeah, the repatriation, that was because the US wanted the Filipinos to go back. I think.
Right.
I think that was that act, right? And it was a
Yes.
one-way ticket.
Right,
But they couldn't come back to the US.
exactly.
They couldn't come back to the US.
So, you know, my thought was, you know, never having seen or read anything about the returning Filipinos that went home with single or with families, how were they received by, you know, their families in the Philippines and by, you know, the general feeling, because they were going back home during this golden period of colonialism.
Mhm. I guess that would depend on the families that received them and the Filipinos and their families who returned, because they would have returned and taken that repatriation, you know, act privilege ticket, because probably their life in the US was not what they expected, or they were not making any progress in the US. So they decided to go back to the Philippines. Again, the families in the Philippines, how they would have accepted them could be in so many different ways. It could be, oh, wow, you were in the US, you were in the US, and if they made good, then they brought back home something. If they didn't, it would be, why did you leave? It would, I don't know.
Exactly, that's just my thought.
Yeah,
You
it
know,
would be
because
that. Yes, it would be that way. When I first read about the Repatriation Act, I myself too asked that question. Why would you take a ticket, one-way ticket back to the Philippines? Maybe because it was such a good time at that time, 1934, and it was peacetime, was the best of times. So they probably figured my life here in the US is not that good. So maybe I'll go back with my family and maybe did better in the Philippines. Who knows? Who knows? But then the war breaks out, and that made life for them worse. I guess, it's a lot of these Filipinos, wherever they were caught. They were kind of caught. Those who came here, they were caught in a discrimination. So they were caught and trapped. They had to take menial jobs. Okay, menial jobs. Then the war breaks out. They joined because the discrimination wasn't as bad in the military. Military was more equal in their treatment, although there were segregated units, like the the blacks and the Japanese. So many different reasons why Filipinos go back and forth.
I think in my particular family, some of my older uncles went back because they had families back in the Philippines and they had come to the States to, as you say, get money to send home to make it better for them. The younger ones who stayed in the States were single when they came over. And so it seemed like they then ended up having families here in the States, and that's why they stayed in the States. So that might be one reason. At least that was partially what was happening in my particular family.
Mm-hmm. Ed Brotonel just sent a message that the file of the veteran or whoever fought was called the 201 file. Yes, yeah, Ed, there is a 201 file, but I don't know if the entire file, is given out. Maybe part of it. So, but yeah, it's a 201 file, and those files can be found in the National Archives in the U.S. 201 files of the, let's see, who fought, let's say, well, how am I gonna say that? Yeah, who fought in the, in World War II in the Philippines.
Anybody else have any questions? This is this thing about the military, your information on that is, yeah, that is a whole nother good topic to discuss. I hope that you do decide to present something at the Seattle conference if you're able. And because, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that people aren't going to hear about it, and unless it's presented somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, comments? Richard, anything?
No, I'm still thinking about your grandfather that came over from the Locos provinces.
Whose grandfather?
Oh, he was from Panay, huh?
My grandfather was from Panay, from
Yeah.
the Visayas, yeah.
The Visayas, yeah.
Yeah, and he went to Hawaii, but because two other of his cousins also were recruited for Hawaii, and that was 1912, 1913. And we did have an uncle or whatever that came over in the 20s, and he went back during the repatriation. He was the only one in our family that went back because here it was the Depression, here it was discrimination, here it, and there was so many in our family that were here already. He figured, oh, I'll just go back home and take my money, take money back with me. And he never came back. And yeah.
I'd like to share with you a little anecdote of my own personal, when I was a little girl in the Philippines after the war. I was about, 9 years old. So that would be, it was right after, it was the good times. The Americans had taken over. After the war, okay, there was that Constitution, right? That was written by the Philippine Assembly in preparation for their 1946 independence. Okay, but in that Constitution, it was written by the Filipinos, but the Americans still had control. So for the next 20 years after the war, the Americans still had control of Philippine economics. The Philippines became exclusively dependent on the US to economically prosper. What I'm saying is some not so good things that happened. The Americans did not support agricultural progress. It was all like kind of manufacturing, and that when Filipinos exported items to the US, they were taxed. But when the US goods, canned goods, all these imported goods, they call them Blue Seal at that time. I remember that, cigarettes. When they would send it to the Philippines, it was tax-free. So there were two acts that sort of tried to curtail that. But for 20 years, the Americans kind of controlled the Philippines, economically. There was no real industrialization that was in the hands of Filipinos. It was American corporations and American-led companies during those 20, 30 years. The focus was, yes, on American culture. Okay, focus was on American culture. So in that way, the culture and the heroes of the Philippines were sort of like, it was sort of, how do you call it, secondary to some extent. But nobody really complained about that much, because they had good life under the American rule. Then there was, the Filipino culture has this communal spirit, very family oriented. And that also was affected by the American individualistic and capitalistic, materialistic point of view. So those are the things that was heavily influenced the Filipino thinking during the American regime. But there were still Philippine leaders and lawmakers who clamored for independence. And so that's why the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 prepared preparation for independence in 1946. Okay, going back to my experience, is to show you the a differentiation after the war, soon after the war. There is a club in Manila called the Army Navy Club. Is anybody familiar with that? No, I wish I could just pull up a picture of it. Army Navy Club. That club was established before the war, and it was for American officers only. Filipinos could enter it if they were guests of American officers. Like, for example, but there would be like powerful Filipinos, like those in the government, the president and his cabinets and other landowners, elite families of the Philippines. So that was it. After the war, that continued on. After the war, it became a sort of a recreation area for American officers and families. One time we went there, my dad brought us there because they have a swimming pool and we could go swimming, my brother and I. We were stopped at the gate. The military security guards were Filipinos and they would not let us enter. All they saw was Filipino. And because nobody's Filipino was supposed to enter without any chaperone or support or something from an American or a white Caucasian, whatever. So my dad was livid. He was angry. He had to speak to the general manager and show his credentials. And with that, there was apologies and he was let in as an American officer, a Filipino American officer. So the part about this I wanted to share is that every time we would go there, the guards, the Filipino military guards would salute my dad, like, wow, like as if their hands were gonna fly off. So proud that one of them, Filipino, was entering Army Navy Club, an officer too. So I wanted to share that, some of the things that you still undergo after American influence and after the war. And now that club is open to Filipinos. It's been turned over to the Filipinos many years ago, but that still happened even after the war. So,
Okay.
Any other questions?
Anything else for Marie?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the main thing is there were different points of views of how Filipinos felt in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. There was
versus in the Filipinos here, on how they were treated and how their lives,
Yes. One thing I wanted to point out is the elite in the Philippines at that time. Okay, they sent their kids to school in the U.S. So the kids who had money, they went to good schools, Stanford and so on. They could afford everything and so like that. So, but these kids were sent there because to come back, they would run their family businesses. So they never stayed in the U.S. They never did. They came back. They had a better life in the Philippines because they were already of the elite. They didn't lack the money and the power. So there is those classes that I think we forget about. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Anybody? Well, we thank you very much for
All
your
right.
knowledge and for sharing it with us. And maybe in the future we can, you know, hone in on either just the military stuff or whatever, whatever you feel that you'd like to discuss with us. And we do hope that you'll be able to come back to the FANHS Museum someday. And hopefully the FANHS Museum will get to be open on a regular basis again.
Yeah. Yes.
Once everything's back to normal or some kind of a normal. So we thank you, everybody, for showing up, for coming. And we will have another presentation in October for Filipino American History Month. We have another author, Maria Alvarez Stroud, who'll be talking about a book that she wrote about her father's coming over here from the Philippines. That'll be on October 10th, same time, 1:30. And we'll have more information out about that. And we just hope that everybody, you know, takes all this information and can learn something from it and can, you know, pass it on to others who might be interested. So thank you, Marie, for being here. Thank you for your support. And goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for coming. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.